It was an ordinary day of Ohio school, which ended with a wild attack of lion. But what are the details? What led to this shocking incident? Join us as we dive deep into this case. The story you about to heart will make your question reality. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the sheriff's office received the first call. It was a regular morning for most of Ohio's rural community, the kind where dew clung to the grass and the smell of fresh earth and pine lingered in the air. The kind of morning where everything seemed peaceful until it wasn't. A neighbor, an elderly woman named Martha from 2 miles down the road, had been out for her usual early walk when she noticed something strange. The Jones family's house, a large 2-story farmhouse surrounded by tall trees and a small barn, was eerily quiet. No sign of movement, no sounds of children playing or animals stirring. The place was usually bustling, but today it was as still as a graveyard. When she approached the house, she saw the back door wide open, and at first she thought nothing of it. Perhaps Carl had gone out for an early morning errand, or Linda had left to fetch something, but something gnawed at her, a cold feeling creeping down her spine. She made her way to the porch and knocked on the door. Silence. When no one answered, she tried the door. It was unlocked, which was uncharacteristic for the family. They were always cautious, locking up tightly, especially after dark. Her unease began to mount, and she called for Carl. No response. With hesitation gnawing at her, Martha stepped inside the house. The familiar scent of coffee and breakfast was missing, replaced by a stifling quiet. The house seemed undisturbed at first, but a subtle shift in the atmosphere made her heart race. She moved cautiously through the kitchen, where she saw the remnants of breakfast dishes still set out on the table. Empty bowls of cereal, spilled milk, and a jug of orange juice left half poured. But there were no signs of the family, no signs of life. When Martha turned the corner into the hallway, she saw the first sign that something was terribly wrong: blood. Dark streaks ran along the floor, leading toward the living room, her breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward, heart pounding, her body screaming at her to turn around, to leave, to run. But she couldn't. She had to see. She had to know. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, dialing the sheriff's office, barely able to get the words out through her shaky breath. "Something's happened. At the Jones house," she managed to say before the call disconnected. Her legs moved on their own, carrying her forward as she walked toward the source of the blood. What Martha saw when she stepped into the living room would forever be seared into her memory. It was a scene of utter carnage, one that would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. The bodies of Carl and Linda Jones lay sprawled on the floor, their bodies twisted unnaturally. Carl's face was frozen in an expression of shock, his eyes wide, his mouth agape, as if he had tried to scream. Linda was next to him, her body contorted in a similar position, her hands reaching out toward him, as though she had tried to protect him, to pull him away from whatever had come for them. But there was no escaping it. The blood that coated the floor, the walls, and the furniture painted a grim picture of violence, of desperation. It was clear that the attack had been swift and brutal. The carnage was unfathomable, but what sent the deepest chill into Martha's bones was the silence. There were no sounds of movement, no one left to help. It was as if the life had been sucked out of the house entirely. And then, as if guided by some unseen force, her eyes moved toward the stairs. It was then that she saw the children, 4 of them. They too were lifeless, scattered throughout the house, some in the hallway, others in the rooms where they had likely been sleeping. The youngest, a boy of 8, was found curled in a corner of the living room, his body crushed under the weight of a fallen chair. His small face was covered in blood, his arms limp by his side, his eyes staring wide open, forever frozen in a state of terror. The older children, 2 girls, were found closer to the kitchen, their bodies left behind in what could only be described as a final, futile attempt to escape. One of the girls had been dragged by the hair, her body positioned almost grotesquely near the pantry door. The other had stumbled only a few feet before she collapsed, her final moments spent in fear. The oldest, a boy of 17, was the last to be found. His body lay in the master bedroom, right next to the window where he had likely tried to escape. But it was too late. Whatever had happened to his family had happened too quickly. Martha's mind reeled as she stood frozen, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. It was as if the house had become a tomb, each room a mausoleum of the family's last moments. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, making it difficult to breathe. The blood, thick and dark, had soaked into the carpets, pooling in places where the family had fallen. Everything, from the overturned furniture to the shattered windows, told a story of struggle, of fear, but nothing could explain how this had happened. Who could do this, and why? How had something so monstrous been allowed to unfold right under their noses? As the minutes dragged on, the sound of approaching sirens grew louder. The police, the sheriff's deputies, and wildlife experts were already on their way, drawn by Martha's frantic call. When they arrived, the full scope of the tragedy began to set in. The scene was more horrific than anyone had anticipated. The authorities immediately sealed off the area, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. They were quick to realize that whatever had happened here was far from an ordinary crime. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a domestic dispute turned violent. Something more sinister was at play. The first responders could do little more than survey the scene, taking note of the blood, the disarray, and the strange lack of any obvious weapon. The absence of human footprints in the bloodstains was especially unsettling. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no weapons left behind. It was as though something else, something far larger and far more dangerous, had come in and committed this terrible act. Theories quickly began to form among the investigators, but no one could quite believe the horror that had unfolded. Could it have been an animal? A large predator, perhaps? The idea seemed unfathomable, but as they scanned the house and the surrounding land, they could find no other explanation. The enormity of the attack, the violence, and the sheer terror the family must have felt. Everything pointed toward something more than just a crime. As the authorities began their initial investigation, they knew they were faced with one of the most bizarre and chilling cases they would ever encounter. What had happened to the Jones family would haunt the community for years to come. The investigation began as soon as the first responders had cordoned off the scene, their initial shock beginning to give way to a grim determination. The bodies of the Jones family lay in the house, a tragic testament to whatever had occurred in the hours before Martha's discovery. Sheriff Bill Larson arrived shortly after, his weathered face a mask of grim professionalism as he surveyed the scene. He had seen death many times in his career, but nothing like this. Nothing so brutal and inexplicable. The first task was to secure the perimeter and ensure that no one tampered with the crime scene. Larson knew that every minute counted. Every piece of evidence could hold the key to unraveling what had happened here. But the question on everyone's mind was the same. Who or what could have done this? Sheriff Larson ordered the deputies to take an immediate inventory of the scene, making sure every detail was recorded. The bloodstains were unlike anything they had ever seen. There were no signs of the family having fought off their attacker in any way, no indication of a struggle in the traditional sense. The bodies were left as they had fallen, twisted, mangled, and lifeless. The absence of any obvious weapon was a haunting detail. It seemed almost as though the family had been overwhelmed by some force greater than themselves, a force so powerful that they had no chance of survival. Larson's first instinct was to consider the possibility of an animal attack. Ohio had its fair share of wildlife, and large predators like wolves and even the occasional cougar could occasionally be spotted in the more rural areas. But this wasn't the work of a wolf. There was something far more disturbing at play. The bodies had been torn apart with precision, as though the attacker had been skilled in its methods. Some wounds were deep, others shallow, but all of them were horrific. And the lack of visible tracks outside, the absence of blood splatter in the yard, only deepened the mystery. If an animal had been responsible, it would have left a trail. Footprints, fur, claw marks, something. But there was nothing. The wildlife experts were among the first to arrive, their skepticism palpable. They knew better than anyone the habits of the creatures that roamed Ohio's forests, and none of them could fathom how an animal, particularly one so large, could have gotten so close to the family without triggering some kind of warning. They began to comb the area outside, scanning the tree lines, the brush, and the fields for any signs of a wild animal. It didn't take long for them to come to a troubling realization. No large footprints, no signs of fur, no broken branches, no claw marks, not even a trail of disturbed earth. The ground surrounding the Jones house was unmarked by anything that could explain how an animal had made its way inside. Sheriff Larson couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary attack. Every theory he had ran into dead ends. If it had been a human, the brutality would have been different. The sheer force of the wounds, the way the family had been positioned, the absence of any signs of a human struggle, all of it pointed towards something else, some kind of animal, or something that behaved like an animal. The investigators expanded their search, bringing in additional forensic teams to examine the house itself. They collected blood samples from the floor, swabbing every surface they could. They examined the family's personal belongings, looking for any clues, any sign that something might have triggered this unimaginable violence. But the more they combed through the house, the more they realized that there was very little to go on. There were no signs of forced entry, no disturbed locks, no broken windows. Everything seemed to indicate that the family had simply been caught unawares, their lives shattered in an instant. The police canvassed the neighborhood, asking anyone who might have seen anything unusual the night before. But no one had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. It was as though the world had simply stopped turning when the attack occurred. A week passed and still no answers. The sheriff's office was flooded with calls from the community, concerned neighbors, worried parents, and people who had heard rumors and wanted to offer their own theories. It was a quiet town and everyone knew each other. The Jones family had been well-liked, respected members of the community. Carl worked at a local factory, Linda ran a small farm, and the kids went to the local school. They were regular people, not involved in anything that might have made them a target. The investigation's lack of progress began to stir unease throughout the town. Questions that had been left unanswered only seemed to multiply. One particular lead stood out, an anonymous tip that suggested the Jones family had been involved in something more than just their simple, everyday lives. The tip came from someone who claimed to have seen a large, dangerous animal in the area weeks before the attack. According to the report, the animal was unlike anything the tipster had ever seen. It was massive, much larger than a wolf, and it moved with an eerie quiet, almost as if it was hunting. The tipster had described it as having an almost human-like presence, its movements predatory but methodical. But the tip had come in too late, after the crime scene had already been secured. By the time the authorities checked into the tipster's story, they found that there was no concrete evidence to suggest an animal had been in the area. Still, the thought lingered in the back of their minds. Could this have been the work of something unnatural, something outside of their experience? In the days that followed, the sheriff's office received another troubling lead, this one even more disturbing than the last. Several local residents had heard strange growling noises coming from the woods in the days leading up to the attack. These noises were unlike anything they had ever heard before. Deep, guttural growls, the kind of sounds that seemed to resonate through the trees and set the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end. But no one had thought much of it at the time, dismissing the noises as the result of animals fighting or some other natural occurrence. But now, with the Jones family's deaths hanging over them like a dark cloud, the significance of those sounds seemed undeniable. Sheriff Larson had the entire area combed again. Wildlife experts began conducting deeper investigations, focusing not just on the obvious signs of animal tracks, but on the possibility that something else was involved, something larger, something more dangerous. They expanded the search radius, scouring the surrounding woods, creeks, and fields for any evidence of a large predator. The investigators also began interviewing hunters and trappers in the area, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual. But once again, the answers came back with little to go on. No one had seen anything out of the ordinary. No one had reported anything even remotely close to the tragedy that had occurred at the Jones home. With every day that passed, the investigation became more complex, and the mystery deepened. Sheriff Larson knew that he was running out of options. The town was growing restless, and rumors about the family's deaths were spreading like wildfire. People began to talk about curses and strange creatures lurking in the woods. The theories were wild, ranging from the plausible to the utterly fantastical, but Larson knew one thing for sure. He was no closer to finding the truth than he had been when he first stepped foot in the house, and the longer the investigation dragged on, the more the mystery seemed to grow. Whatever had happened to the Jones family, whatever had killed them, was unlike anything they had ever encountered before, and until they found an answer, the questions would continue to gnaw at them, unanswered and unrelenting. The air inside the house felt thick with the remnants of chaos, the sound of the storm still rumbling faintly in the distance, but the worst had passed. Rachel, barely able to catch her breath, had found herself at the edge of a new kind of fear. A fear not just of the unknown, but of the very ground beneath her feet. She had thought she was going to die there, in that isolated house in Ohio, like the others, but she had survived, against all odds, and now it was time to move. Her body was shaking uncontrollably, each step she took feeling like a deliberate effort to defy the terror that still gripped her. Her legs felt weak, her chest tight, the blood still pulsing in her ears from the fear. Rachel knew that leaving the house was not just a choice, it was a necessity. There was no time to second-guess herself, no time for hesitation. The attack had been too fast, too brutal, and there was nothing left in the house but death. The others were gone. She didn't know where they had gone or how the creature had taken them, but she knew they were never coming back. It had started out as a quiet evening, just like any other. Rachel had been there, in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when the house had begun to shake, the windows rattling with the impact of something enormous outside. The windows had shown nothing, just the night, the storm raging through the trees. But she had felt it, that ominous pressure building in the air. Then came the sounds, the guttural growls that sent her heart into overdrive. She remembered the terror flooding her senses as she had locked the door, listening to the movement outside, the sound of massive paws dragging across the ground, the rattling of the door as if something large had tried to force its way inside. The first sign that the creature was inside the house had been the heavy breathing, wet and low, filling the air like an oppressive fog. Rachel had been frozen in place, unable to make a sound, unable to even think. She had wanted to run, wanted to scream for help, but the terror that gripped her was suffocating. It was too late for that. She had heard the crash of furniture being overturned, the high-pitched scream of her youngest brother, a sound so raw and primal that it shattered her thoughts. Her instinct had kicked in. She had to move. She had to escape. Rachel's body had moved without her consent, her legs carrying her into the hallway, away from the dining room where the others had been gathered moments before. She could still hear the thundering noise of footsteps, and then the sound of her family's screams, which cut through the silence like knives. Her father's voice had been drowned out by the monstrous growls, and then nothing. Silence. The night outside had seemed like a twisted reflection of the nightmare unfolding in the house. The storm was still there, raging through the trees, but now there was nothing but darkness around her, enveloping her as if the entire world had turned black. The house had been no sanctuary. Every corner, every room she passed felt like a potential death trap. It was too late for the others, but she could still feel the overwhelming pull of fear, urging her to keep moving, to survive, to escape. In a daze, Rachel had made her way toward the back door. She could hear the beast, whatever it was, moving through the house, its heavy breathing drawing closer, a low growl echoing off the walls. She had no time. She fumbled for the door handle, the cold steel a relief in the chaos of the house. Her fingers trembled as she twisted it, the door creaking open to the night. It was only then, as the cool wind washed over her, that she realized how much she had been suffocating within the walls. She hadn't looked back. There was no point. What was left for her to look back to? Her family, her home, everything had been obliterated. The weight of the loss was like a stone in her chest. But there was no time to grieve. There was only one thing left to do: survive. The ground outside was slick with mud, the storm turning the earth beneath her into a thick, treacherous mess. Rachel's shoes sank with every step, but she kept moving, putting one foot in front of the other. She didn't know where she was going, but that didn't matter. She couldn't afford to stop. Every now and then the ground would tremble beneath her, a reminder that whatever was chasing her was still out there, somewhere in the dark. She couldn't let her mind wander, couldn't afford to think about what might be lurking in the trees. She just kept running, her body screaming for rest, but she refused to listen. Her lungs burned as she struggled to keep her pace, the sound of her breath ragged in her ears. She had no idea how long she had been running, how far she had gone, but everything around her was indistinct, just shadows and shapes blending into the inky night. It was only when the trees began to thin, when the land started to open up into a large field, that Rachel dared to look around. She couldn't afford to let the terror take over. She had to keep focused. There was a house in the distance, a faint glow of light spilling from the windows. It was the only sign of life she had seen since the attack began. Her heart skipped a beat as she made her way toward it. It was a farmhouse, isolated, much like hers had been, but it was a sign of hope, and that was all she needed. She had to get there. She had to make it. But as she stumbled forward, the pain in her legs mounting with every step, a scream echoed through the night, a chilling reminder that she wasn't alone. Her heart stopped in her chest. That sound, so guttural, so terrifying, it was the same sound she had heard before. Rachel's feet faltered. She wanted to call out, to scream for help, but her voice caught in her throat. She could feel the eyes of the creature on her, even without turning to look. The growl, now closer, was unmistakable. It was the sound of death itself, stalking her through the night, its breath hot on her heels. Her survival instinct flared again. The house was so close, but she couldn't risk being caught. Her body screamed for her to move faster, to ignore the burning exhaustion that threatened to cripple her. But it was the primal fear, the need to escape, that kept her going. Her legs carried her forward, but the creature was closer now. Its growl reverberated in the air, shaking her to the core. She had to make it, but her body was slowing. She had never run this far in her life. And then, out of nowhere, a sharp pain erupted in her side, a jagged breath that came from nowhere, as if the night itself had turned against her. The creature was so close now she could hear its footsteps. She could feel it. She pushed forward, each step a battle, each breath a struggle, and just as she thought she might collapse, she reached the door of the farmhouse. She slammed her fist against it, banging with all the strength she had left, praying for someone, anyone, to hear her. And then, miraculously, the door creaked open. The last thing she remembered was stumbling into the arms of someone on the other side, the door slamming shut behind her, with a finality that sealed off the nightmare she had narrowly escaped. The wind howled through the trees outside, a ferocious storm lashing against the windows with a persistent fury that mirrored the unease creeping into the house. The faint hum of the power lines buzzing through the air provided a strange sense of normalcy in the otherwise oppressive silence. Inside, the room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls like dark fingers. The storm outside seemed to feed the tension in the house, a primal sense of foreboding that everyone ignored, chalking it up to the weather. Rachel stood by the kitchen counter, cutting vegetables for dinner, her hands moving methodically through the motions. The rhythmic sound of the knife slicing through the ingredients was strangely soothing, grounding her in the moment. She had always found peace in the quiet tasks of preparing meals, the steady work of her hands carving out a small slice of order in an otherwise unpredictable world. But tonight that peace was elusive. There was an undercurrent of something, a disquiet she couldn't shake. It began with a low, almost imperceptible rumble beneath her feet. At first she thought it was just the storm, a distant clap of thunder perhaps, but as it continued, her mind began to race. The ground beneath her shifted slightly, a subtle tremor that wasn't entirely in her imagination. Her grip tightened around the knife, and a prickle of unease ran up her spine. She glanced around the kitchen, half expecting to see something or someone out of place. But the room was empty. The only sound, the occasional drop of rain splattering against the window. Then came the growl. It was low, almost inaudible at first, but it reverberated through the walls, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Her breath caught in her throat. She froze, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. The growl wasn't an animal's typical noise. It was guttural, unnatural, a vibration that seemed to reach into her very bones. Her pulse quickened, and her hand trembled as it hovered over the knife, suddenly feeling very insignificant in the face of something so incomprehensibly monstrous. Rachel's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the sound. Was it a bear? A wolf? Her first instinct was to dismiss the thought, but the growl came again, louder this time, followed by a series of heavy thuds that rattled the walls. The house seemed to shake with the force of it. Her stomach dropped. There was something out there, something that didn't belong in the quiet woods surrounding the house, something that was much larger, much more terrifying than any animal she could imagine. The silence returned as suddenly as it had been broken. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but in the house, it felt like a strange, pregnant stillness had settled. Rachel's breath came in short, shallow gasps. Her eyes darted around, looking for any sign of movement, but everything remained still, unnervingly so. She took a cautious step back from the counter, listening. Her feet barely made a sound on the wooden floor. The house was eerily quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable, thickening with each passing second. Another rumble. This time it was closer, louder. The floor seemed to shake with it, a deep, unsettling tremor that made the dishes in the cupboard rattle. Rachel's heart pounded in her ears. She should have moved, should have gone to find the others, but she couldn't. Something inside her had rooted her to the spot, and her mind was screaming at her to do something, anything, but the terror that had a grip on her was paralyzing. Her legs felt like stone. The growl came again, and this time it was joined by a shrill, screeching sound that tore through the air, sending a jolt of fear straight through Rachel's core. She didn't know what it was, what kind of creature could produce such a sound, but the dread was suffocating. She had to move. The instinct to run surged through her, but the floor beneath her seemed to become slick, unsteady, as if the house itself were sinking into the ground. The pressure in her chest grew unbearable, the weight of impending danger pressing down on her. She could hear something moving outside, the distinct thud of heavy footsteps, like something, or someone, was circling the house. Her mind raced. What was it? Was it a bear? A wolf? No, it was something else. The way it moved, the way it sounded, it wasn't natural. The growls had an eerie cadence to them, almost like a language, or something trying to communicate. The back door slammed open, the wind howling in as if invited, but it was only for a moment. The force of the gust shook the house, and Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what had caused it, but the feeling in her gut told her it wasn't just the storm. It was something much worse. Then came the crash. It came from somewhere deeper in the house, a sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. Rachel's heart stopped, and her breath hitched. Whatever it was inside. The growls were no longer just outside. They were close, too close. They were coming from the hallway, from the very rooms where her family had been just moments before. Her thoughts snapped back to the others, her mind desperately trying to make sense of what was happening, but the noise from the hallway, the crashing, the guttural sounds, made it clear. They were under attack. Her legs suddenly obeyed, propelled forward by sheer instinct. She needed to get out, to escape, but the creature, whatever it was closing in. Its growl became louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a beast. It was something else, something unnatural, something that had no business in this world. It was hunting them. Rachel's feet moved quickly, the floor slipping beneath her as she dashed toward the door, her heart pounding. But before she could reach it, there was another sound, something even more terrifying than the growls. It was the unmistakable sound of claws on wood, scraping, tearing, like a predator closing in on its prey. The creature was on the other side of the door. Her body froze, but it wasn't fear that held her in place now. It was a sharp, burning realization. There was no escape. The growl rose to a fever pitch. The walls seemed to close in around her, the oppressive weight of the creature's presence suffocating. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Every part of her screamed to flee, but the terror rooted her to the spot, each breath a struggle to fight the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the growling stopped. A sickening silence enveloped the house, leaving only the sound of her own frantic breathing. Rachel dared not move. The storm outside continued its rage, but inside, the only thing that mattered was the pounding of her heart, a grim reminder that the nightmare was far from over. The storm had not let up. In fact, it had worsened, sending waves of wind that slammed against the windows with a ferocity that rattled the house to its very foundation. Lightning flickered in the sky, illuminating the dark forest surrounding the house, casting eerie shadows on the trees that loomed like silent sentinels. Inside, the air was thick with the cold dread, the kind of silence that wraps itself around your throat and squeezes until it's hard to breathe. Inside, Rachel knew that nothing would be the same after tonight. The thing that had invaded her home, the creature that had torn her family apart, was still out there, and it wasn't finished. The hunt had begun. Rachel had no choice but to face the reality of the situation. She could no longer pretend it was a nightmare, a figment of her imagination. The destruction, the terror, it was real. Her family, her life had been shattered in the blink of an eye. The creature that had invaded her home had proven itself capable of violence unlike anything she had ever seen before, and the terror it left in its wake was just beginning to sink in. Now, there was no question. She had to survive. She had to fight back. With trembling hands, she grabbed the old hunting rifle her father had kept in the closet. It had always been a symbol of the rugged, independent life they had lived here in Ohio. A life where nature was something to be respected, but also something to be tamed. It had never crossed her mind that she might need it like this, against something not of this world, something far more dangerous than any wild animal. But tonight, it was her only chance. Rachel moved carefully through the house, her steps slow and deliberate. She knew the creature was still out there, prowling through the woods, perhaps circling the house, waiting for another moment of weakness. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, the sense that the predator could strike at any moment, gnawing at her. The hallway was dark, the shadows creeping in from every corner. She barely dared to glance over her shoulder. Her mind focused on what lay ahead, but the weight of the silence made the atmosphere even more suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet seemed to echo louder than it should. The house was no longer the safe haven it had been earlier in the evening. Every room, every hallway now seemed like a potential trap, a place where she could be cornered or ambushed at any moment. Her only refuge was the rifle. The cold metal of it pressed tightly against her body, its weight both a comfort and a curse. She was about to step into the unknown, into the very heart of the danger that had already taken so much from her. Outside, the storm raged on, a relentless force of nature that mirrored the chaos in her mind. It wasn't just the thunder and the wind. It was the very feeling of the earth itself being unsettled, as if nature itself were being violated by the presence of something unnatural. Rachel could almost feel the creature's breath on the other side of the walls, the weight of its hunger pressing down on the house like a terrible force of gravity. She didn't know what it was. She couldn't begin to fathom the kind of monster that could do what it had done. But she knew that it was out there, and it wasn't done. She stepped outside, her boots sinking into the wet, muddy ground. The rain hit her face like needles and the wind howled through the trees, but she didn't flinch. She had to keep moving, had to find the creature before it found her. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat like a drum of war, but she kept her focus. She knew the forest well, knew the paths, the streams, the hidden corners. She had grown up here, and now that knowledge would be her weapon. If she was going to survive, she had to use every advantage at her disposal. As she moved deeper into the woods, the trees began to close in around her, their thick trunks like sentinels watching her every step. The ground was slick with rain, and the branches above her shook violently in the wind. Every sound was amplified: the creaking of trees, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals that had long since fled the area. Everything seemed out of place, distorted by the storm. The forest was no longer the peaceful refuge it had once been. Now, it was a labyrinth of danger, every turn holding the potential for disaster. Rachel's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the creature. She had no idea what kind of monster she was hunting, but she knew one thing: it was smart. It was watching her just as she was watching it. She could feel its eyes on her, the sense that she was being stalked, the way the air seemed to grow heavier as she moved. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her grip on the rifle tightened. She was no longer just a woman trying to survive. She was a hunter, and the predator she sought was her only prey. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something was moving in the shadows ahead. A large shape, something dark and hulking, darted between the trees. Her pulse quickened. The thing was close. Rachel took a cautious step forward, every nerve in her body alert. She knew she had to be careful. If she made one wrong move, it could be over in an instant. The sound of the storm, the crashing waves of wind, and the heavy patter of rain on the ground all seemed to fade away as she focused on the creature, on the sound of its movements. Then it happened. There was a rustle of leaves, a snap of a branch. The creature was moving, coming closer, and it was fast. It was silent, too. There was no growl, no warning, just a sudden shift in the air, a feeling of something enormous and powerful approaching. Rachel spun around, raising the rifle, her finger already on the trigger. But she saw nothing, only the darkness, the rain, and the storm. But she knew it was out there, just beyond the reach of her sight. Watching, waiting, the hunt had become a battle of wills. Rachel was determined to find the beast, to end the nightmare it had started. But the creature was no less determined. It was as much a predator as she was a prey, and it was using every trick it knew to evade her, to toy with her. It had a mind of its own, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. And Rachel? She was now a part of its world, its twisted game. And in this game, the stakes were nothing less than her life. As dawn finally broke through the heavy clouds, the forest seemed eerily quiet, the storm's fury now reduced to nothing more than a distant murmur. The once lush and vibrant woods were now silent witnesses to the horror that had unfolded. Rachel stood motionless, her body drenched from the rain, her eyes scanning the dark expanse before her. The rifle in her hands, though gripped with determination, felt like a burden now, a symbol of a battle that had already been lost. The creature, relentless and unforgiving, had disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind only the shattered remnants of what had once been a home. The family, the innocents of the night, were gone, their lives ripped apart by a predator that had proven itself too cunning and powerful to be vanquished. Rachel's heart weighed heavy with the realization that no matter how hard she fought, it had never been enough. She had tracked the beast through the woods, feeling its presence in the shadows, always just out of reach. Her pursuit had been fueled by fear, by the need for closure, but now, standing alone in the aftermath, she understood the true cost of survival. There was no victory in this, only an aching emptiness that threatened to consume her. The monster might have been defeated, but at what price? The family she had lost could never be replaced, the lives extinguished too quickly for any revenge to bring solace. The hunt had ended, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain, forever etched in her mind. The tragedy of that night had no resolution. There would be no peace.